My name's Chris Pockney. I am an ecologist with Biolinks Alliance, and I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm coming at you tonight from Taungurung country and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend those respects to all the First Nations peoples whose lands we work across Central Victoria, and any First Nations people with us tonight. A little bit of housekeeping. So this meeting is being recorded, so please keep that in mind. Keep your videos and microphones off. And if questions do pop into your head throughout the presentation, please pop them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So if you've joined us before, you're usually used to me giving you this spiel at the start and then handing off to a wonderful presenter. But tonight you're just going to hear from me, and I'm going to fill you in on what we're doing with our Glideways in Central Victoria initiative, the learnings that we're sort of building from that over the last year or two, and introduce you to some of the glider species that that we find in our region. So we've got 6 species of gliders in Victoria, and through Glideways in Central Victoria, we sort of consider all of these in the projects that we're doing, as well as the brush-tailed phascogale, which is obviously not a glider, but shares a lot of the same sort of habitat characteristics and threats. The initiative is a part of a much bigger Glideways initiative spearheaded by the Great Eastern Ranges, and that extends from us down here in Central Victoria right up to far north Queensland and the Cape York Peninsula. So everything we're doing here is contributing to a much bigger concerted effort across all of Eastern Australia, but obviously really tapping into that local knowledge and expertise that we've got here in Central Victoria to make sure that these species can persist and thrive in our region. So I'll briefly introduce you to each of these species in a moment, and you can hear about, I guess, why some of them are threatened, and that's a key reason for why Glideways in Central Victoria sort of came about, is that half of these species here are threatened in Victoria, and the declines we see in gliders and phascogales are really representative of broader issues that we face across our state, across Australia, and indeed the world. The habitat loss, fragmentation, logging, fire, climate change, these sorts of things that we hear a lot about. They're threatening all of these species here on the screen, and that's sort of the reasons that they continue to decline. Habitat connectivity at large scales is a really vital function that we as people have interrupted over the last 250 years or so, in particular in Australia, and we've got to work to restore that. So these species all require well-connected habitat to move around, and find enough area to feed, shelter, and find mates, as well as to access areas of climate refugia as the current habitat begins to really feel the impacts of climate change, as we've been seeing in recent times. So they're really clearly emblematic of some of our bigger issues around habitat connectivity. And of course, when we look after gliders, we're not just looking after gliders. So across their range, these species inhabit a real diversity of habitats. And so by looking after glider habitat, we're also providing habitat for so many threatened and iconic species, things like swift parrots, koalas, powerful owls, leadbeaters, possums, barking owls, and even mountain skinks. So we're looking after the needs of these guys. We're ensuring that so many other species as well are able to persist into the future. So the first one of these species I'll introduce you to is the yellow-bellied glider, and it's probably one that a lot of people across Central Victoria are not that familiar with. They're widespread along the east coast of Australia, and here in the southeast, this subspecies is listed as vulnerable. They inhabit a whole range of habitat types throughout their distribution. Up in the far northern sort of wet tropics, they tend to inhabit these tall, wet sclerophyll forests. And they in much more open habitat forests and woodlands from central Queensland right through to southeast Queensland, and then in the southern part of their range in Victoria here, much more sort of wetter and montane areas, and places like East Gippsland, the Otways, and Central Highlands are strongholds in Victoria. And they're a really active and social species. They forage in family groups and regularly call to one another throughout their home range through a night. They've got some pretty distinctive and pretty scary noises if you're out camping in the bush at night. Hopefully, you can hear a couple of them here. Hopefully, they came through all right. Just a couple of short snippets of the types of noises that these guys make, and yeah, they're pretty distinctive. They also make these really distinctive notches in feed trees. Tree sap makes up a really large part of their diet, and so their preferred feed trees can be identified by these V-shaped scarring, which the yellow belly gliders incised, and you can sort of see what it looks like uh, up the whole trunk of a tree, and then at close range there too. So in central Victoria, there's some old records of yellow belly gliders throughout. I think places like the Strathbogie Ranges, some records from 1996, and heading further west, some records from the 80s in Mount Cole and the 90s from Black Range. But in recent times, the only places these guys have been somewhat reliably recorded is around the Tallarook and Mount Disappointment state forests, which are sort of the closest bits of potential habitat to their Central Highlands population. So, because of this relative sort of scarcity, they're not a key focus of any Glideways Central Victoria projects, but there is an outside chance of finding them as we work through parts of Tallarook and Mount Disappointment as part of the Murchison Gap Greater Glider Biolink project. Feathertail gliders are another relatively poorly known species in the area. They're the smallest gliding mammal in the world. They weigh in at about 12 grams. And we believe there's actually two different species of feathertail gliders, both occurring throughout Victoria, and they're really hard to tell apart. So for the purpose of our work, they are grouped. Again, they inhabit a wide range of forest types throughout the distribution, but really with quite a strong preference for tall forests in particular, tall, mature forests. And they'll feed on things like nectar and pollen and invertebrates. So again, they're quite widespread up the east coast, and they're not considered threatened, the feathertail glider, thankfully. But their actual population numbers are really difficult to estimate. They're a tough species to survey. Their small size and tendency to hang out high up in the canopy makes it pretty tricky to really gauge their numbers even at a local level. So there's a lot more to learn about these little guys. The most common glider species throughout most of central Victoria and throughout most of its range is the inland sugar glider or Kreft's glider. So they were previously part of the sugar glider species, which has been recently split into three recognised species. So up in the Northern Territory and northern Western Australia is the Savannah glider. The sugar glider is now only believed to occur on the coastal side of the Great Dividing Range from about Brisbane down through most of New South Wales. And everything else is considered the inland sugar glider or Kreft's glider for the time being. There's a bit of a question mark up there on the Cape York Peninsula, and that's just down to not having much genetic information about gliders up there, but they might be a different grouping again. So these guys occur in a wide range of forest types, and you can kind of infer that from their really broad distribution throughout eastern Australia. And the one thing they really rely on is the presence of hollow-bearing trees. So they'll feed on a wide variety of food, things like insects, spiders, acacia gum, eucalyptus sap, nectar, and lurt, things like that can all make up part of their diet across the year. And they can actually be opportunistically carnivorous as well, so preying on small birds, as well as their eggs. And the most famous example of that is in Tasmania, where this is actually an introduced species. So there's no native sugar gliders in Tasmania, but they've been introduced there and have become a real threat to breeding success of critically endangered swift parrots. So they den in sort of social groups, family groups, and when young are present throughout spring, they really pack the numbers into a den. So we've counted at least 13 individuals in one nest box at one of our project sites. So they really pack them in. And but yeah, so all of our glider species in central Victoria, these are the ones you're most likely to come across if you're so inclined to be out there at night having a look around. Squirrel glider is closely related and very similar in appearance to the inland sugar glider. So a couple of key features to help tell these guys apart is the big bushy tail in the squirrel glider that you can hopefully see in these couple of photos. They're a bigger animal than the sugar gliders, but this can, it's gonna be really hard to tell when you're out at night. You see a glider up in a tree, and they've got a bit of a more sort of a longer, more pointed face and nose and ears than the sugar gliders. Again, they are quite widespread up the east coast, and occur across a variety of habitats on that range. But in Victoria, tend to be found in our drier forests and woodlands. So things like our box ironbark, our grassy woodlands, and I guess if you um, know the area, you'll also know that those types of habitats have suffered pretty extensive degradation over the last little while. So these guys are again really threatened by habitat loss and fragmentation, and they are endangered in Victoria. They occur in some really isolated populations. Quite interestingly, yeah, similarly, most of the occurrences throughout Victoria are quite isolated um, populations, and they tend to rely on large old trees, things like roadside verges, paddock trees. They're often critical habitat, as kind of the only place, the only mature trees left in some of these landscapes. They need habitat to be somewhat connected, which is tricky in a lot of these more agriculture dominated landscapes. So they can glide about 50 meters between trees. They don't go that distance often, but they can. But anything bigger than this across flat ground is basically impossible for a squirrel glider. They really won't come to ground. Very rare for them to come to ground, and when they do, they're really vulnerable. So patches of habitat or even individual trees that are more than 50 meters from the nearest um, the next tree may as well be an island as far as squirrel gliders are concerned. Within that habitat, they need sort of a mix of eucalypts and wattles, and having some species that flower in winter is really important to get them through lower food availability in terms of invertebrates. And connectivity is really important. So Mason Crane did some really cool research in New South Wales in a fragmented habitat. Um, and they tracked some squirrel gliders throughout the year and showed the gliders basically moving upslope to some flowering ironbarks when they were in flower, and then moving back downslope as soon as the ironbarks weren't flowering any longer. So they need to be able to move across these landscapes somehow to be able to access, the whole suite of features and food sources that they need to sort of get through a year. And because of their threat status and their kind of precarious existence in these isolated populations, they are a key focal species for a number of projects across central Victoria. Another threatened and iconic glider found in the area is the southern greater glider. So greater gliders are the largest of the gliding possums, and similar to the sugar gliders, they were previously thought to all be one species, which was recently split into three. So they've got the northern, a central, and a southern greater glider. There's a little bit of uncertainty about where exactly the central species sort of starts and finishes, and where the overlap is, and how the different species interact in those overlap zones. But that's sort of a rough breakdown of where they occur. So greater gliders do range in colour from almost totally white to mostly jet black. So you've possibly seen photos of all sorts of whites and greys and browns and blacks of these guys. really distinctive, big, fluffy ears. They're a really big animal. They look about the size of a domestic cat when they're up in the tree, and with a really beautiful, long, fluffy tail as well. So they're most of the individuals we get in Central Victoria tend to be this mostly jet black with a white belly, but we do also get some white and grey morphs throughout as well. They're mostly a solitary animal. They'll pair up in the breeding season, but otherwise, kind of adults tend to keep to themselves, and they feed pretty much exclusively on eucalypt leaves. So in our area, they're sort of associated with tall forests, with the sorts of eucalypt species like messmate, peppermints, manna gum, and blue gums. The wombat forest is a hotspot for them, along with the Tallarook State Forest as a couple of really good, really significant populations of greater gliders. And then heading east, they occur throughout the Central Highlands and East Gippsland as well. They are endangered, so they've suffered really massive declines across the past 50 years or so, and particularly in recent times, a massive proportion of their range was hit by the in the 2019-2020 bushfires, and sort of in the last 5 years or so, efforts to conserve them have really ramped up. That includes development of really high-tech nest boxes through a collaboration between the Australian National University and WWF Australia, um, which was a really great breakthrough, I guess, after many years of people kind of trying and failing to find a nest box design that greater gliders would actually use. As I mentioned, there's been massive declines, and it's pretty um, disheartening to think of the types of numbers these animals used to be in. Talking to people working in this field, who are um, who talk about when they were growing up and how common greater gliders used to be out in the bush compared to where they are now. So I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that even though we'll talk about places like the Wombat Forest and Tallarook Forest as being, significant greater glider populations, that these are still, severely declined from where they would have been even 30, 40 years ago, and that we keep those longer term baselines in mind when we're thinking about conservation efforts. It's a pretty usual story for the most part with these guys. They're threatened by habitat loss, land clearing, logging, and fire. So both bushfires and prescribed burns can really impact the habitat that greater gliders rely on. But they're also quite sensitive to temperature increases. So they're threatened by climate change, as the temperatures do increase across much of Australia. So they're particularly sensitive to high temperatures, and they may not leave their hollow to feed if the temperature doesn't drop below about 20 degrees Celsius. So if the overnight temperatures don't get below this, then a glider might simply just stay in its den for the whole night, won't come out to feed, and it can take as few as 3 consecutive nights like this for a southern greater glider to die from dehydration. So this has sort of restricted them, or they've been really well adapted to the areas where we find them in sort of higher elevation areas, and particularly in damp gullies. But in recent years, even those sort of refugia for species like greater gliders have started to experience the impacts of climate change. So just sort of rounding home the importance of connectivity so that they can move across the landscape and into areas which have been sort of identified as climate refugia. And finally, not a glider, but sharing many of the same sort of requirements and threats is the brush-tailed phascogale. These are widespread, again, but they're sparsely populated. So because they occur in really low densities across their range, and so at a population level, they can be vulnerable to losing just a really small number of individuals. So something like a cat or a fox knocking off 2, 3, 4 phascogales within an isolated population can spell a lot of trouble for these guys. Like all of our glider species as well, they require hollows to nest in, so they're also sensitive to the loss of mature forests and large trees. Unlike the gliders, phascogales are a dasyurid, so a carnivorous marsupial. So they're related to things like quolls, antechinus, and Tassie devils. They eat mostly invertebrates, things like spiders and cockroaches and moths, but they'll also take vertebrate prey like frogs, lizards, birds, and some small mammals, and they'll potentially scavenge as well. They also move really impressive distances for such a small animal. Really big home range for something their size. Males have been recorded using something like up to 100 hectares. So yeah, really impressive distances covered for something that's yeah, about the size of a rat. Another thing that sort of sets them apart, I guess, in their habitat requirements from the gliders is um, the importance of coarse woody debris, things like fallen branches for phascogales. They'll use them for shelter. They'll use them for foraging. Um, cameras set up on the forest floor kind of shows that if a log is available, the phascogale will move along the log rather than moving along the forest floor. So um, this coarse woody debris, which is often cleared for firewood or cleared because it looks messy, is a real habitat feature for phascogales. They also seem to take a bit of a liking to people's homes at times. So I've heard stories of people finding them living in their rooftops and balconies and even in the pantry. So if you've got a gap in your roof and you're surrounded by phascogale habitat, then yeah, keep an eye out and be very careful with the use of rat traps or anything like that as well. So that's a bit of an introduction into each of the species, very, very high level, but I guess just to give you an idea of the diversity we do have of these species throughout the area. And this map, I guess, showcases the scale of what we're trying to do. There's a whole range. I think there's 12 different projects under this banner between 10 different organizations or groups. So it's a really big effort, and through the number of species we're trying to conserve, you can sort of see why such a spatial scale is needed to cover all different habitat types. There's a variety of projects. They're all, some covering quite a small area intensively, others covering a much bigger area in a more spread out manner. And of course, that all depends on the project aims and the communities involved and target species as well. But I'll I'll sort of touch on a couple of these projects as I get into some of the practical actions that people can actually do about to contribute to glider and phascogale conservation throughout the region. But first is kind of over the last couple of years what we've learnt as a collaboration through Glideways. We've made a concerted effort to really bring the group together and try and ramp up our impact through Glideways in Central Victoria across the last year or two. And so there's some really important things that we've picked up in this time, in the many conversations we've had and the works that we've done. The first thing is that there's heaps that we don't know. So the more you try and understand an animal or an ecosystem, the more you realize you don't know. And an answer usually leads to 3 or 4 new questions. So, and I think that's a good thing. There's never going to be a shortage of things to do in this space, and just being honest with ourselves and being accepting of the fact that we're never going to know it all, and we've got a whole lot to learn from getting out there and doing and trying, and also from each other is really important. And that local communities are key, and they're super keen. That's most of these projects are volunteer, community driven. They usually start from a couple of real champions in their local area who care about a species um, or get really interested in a species and really spread that throughout their local community, whether it's through a land care group or similar, or whether it's just through their neighbours or groups of landholders. But the good that can come from empowering local communities with the knowledge from scientists, as well as kind of the practical know-how from land care groups and other practitioners and things like that is really inspiring. And I think that's kind of the only way we're going to get long-term outcomes from some of these types of projects is by really harnessing enthusiasm in our communities. I guess from that comes the fact that we can actually make a real difference. We've seen throughout a few projects through Glideways that some really positive, measurable differences we've made. So whether that's finding a species in an area where it hasn't been recorded before, or it hasn't been recorded for decades, or from our actions like nest box installation, being able to boost the size of a population that was in the balance in a localized area. So these little efforts that on their own might not seem that significant when you're doing it at a landscape level by sort of these shared efforts between groups, it's really powerful, and we really are making a measurable difference for these species. And I guess bringing the first 3 points together is that collaboration and knowledge sharing is really powerful, and that's collaboration between practitioners, landholders, local government, scientists. Everyone sort of has something to bring to these projects, and the projects that are successful because of the variety of people that are involved. They're um, not working in their own little silo, and sharing that knowledge through a collaborative group like Glideways in Central Victoria uh, has really increased the standard, I think, of some of the projects that are rolling out more and more, because these groups across Central Victoria have all been learning from one another, learning what works and what hasn't worked as well, and sharing that knowledge between one another on a regular basis is yeah, it's really powerful. But there's a whole lot more to do, and Biolinks as an organisation and the 10 organisations involved in Glideways in Central Victoria can't do it all. So everyone sort of has a role to play. The easiest thing that everyone can do is learning and sharing knowledge about your local wildlife and your local environments. Attend events, citizen science events, talks, field days, webinars like this, and talk about it with your family and friends. It's a really powerful being around people who are passionate about this stuff. At a conference last week, saw a really great project presented where they were comparing different predictors of what makes young people different predictors of what makes young people care about nature or connect with nature. And by far, the strongest predictor was that their family cared about nature and had a connection to nature. So I think, sharing what's around, and sharing your care for nature, your enthusiasm with your family and friends can have a really big impact on how they view kind of the world around them as well. Seek out local groups and experts as well. Your local land care group, a local ecologist, someone like that. If you've got questions or just want to know more about things in your area, I guarantee those people will be more than happy to answer your questions and have a chat. And sort of on that note, old stories and anecdotes, as well as traditional Indigenous knowledge, are all really great ways to learn what your area used to look like, and also what's still there. So, landholders who have been there for generations are really great sources of information about what species they used to see, or their parents used to see on their block, what's changed and what's missing. So, um, yeah, those conversations are really priceless. I guess on like social media can be a powerful tool as well. I say when used wisely, there can be issues from sharing photos of a threatened species, for example, with precise location attached, and that can lead to issues for sensitive species where you get people rushing to go see them and things like that. But just using discretion on when you're sharing things on social media, but it can be a really powerful platform to learn about what's in your local area, as well as to communicate and show people the types of amazing stuff they can find locally as well. observe, record, and tell somebody. So if you think you've seen something, a threatened species or one of these glider species, reach out to your local group. We've got this tool through our website where you can actually submit your sightings of these glider species and phascogales if you'd like to, and whether you'd like to actively be involved with what we do, or any particular project or any of our member groups, or whether you just want to contribute to our knowledge of the distributions of these species. That's really helpful too. Share your sightings to a repository, so things like iNaturalist, which is really user friendly and easy to get into for citizen science. And then also the VBA, Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, which is much less user friendly, but I guess more rigorous in terms of having validated records. And that's the system that the Victorian government actually uses for as a reference for anything to do with threatened species in particular. And if you can get a photo of something that you've seen, that's super valuable too. If we can get kind of hard proof that things that threaten species, things like squirrel gliders or greater gliders are in a given area, that's really helpful too, and that can really trigger um, bigger things. So we had a resident from Seymour got in touch with us a couple of years ago saying, I think I've seen a squirrel glider on my property. And so we went out there and within about 20 minutes walking around, found a squirrel glider. And that was the first record of that species in Seymour for over a decade. And it sort of triggered a bigger project and survey effort in Seymour, where we found a handful more squirrel gliders. So there's a population there, right, pretty much in the middle of town, going along the Goulburn River, that we just didn't know about before, and that was all kind of stemmed from one landholder reaching out to say, I think I've seen this thing on my block. There are some things we can do that can have a really big impact quite quickly. Nest boxes are a great example. Ross Goldingay gave a great webinar last month for us. I won't go into too much detail about nest boxes, but he talked all about a lot of work that he's done and other people on how our gliders and phascogales use nest boxes. A really key thing to think about is that nest boxes are really effective for these species in areas where natural hollows are lacking. So I guess just know the area that you're putting boxes up in. Ross presented some really great information about where nest box programs, with the best of intentions, have been unsuccessful because nest boxes have gone up in an area that already had hollows available for those species. So they'll choose the natural hollow every time given the choice. But nest boxes are a really good substitute where hollows aren't available. The other thing is thinking about your target species. So nest box design and where you place it is going to be very different for a greater glider compared to a phascogale. So knowledge of the ecology and requirements of your target species, and that they are actually able to get to your nest boxes, is really important too. So again, if you don't know, reach out to us, reach out to your local landcare group. There will be someone who will be really happy to help. Make sure that if you want to put nest boxes up, that it's a success. So this greater glider is one of three nest boxes that we recorded greater gliders using on a property where we installed these boxes along Kangaroo Creek near the Wombat State Forest, and that was following the development of these kind of high-tech greater glider boxes that are made to spec for greater gliders. So we were able to actually sort of expand the nesting opportunities for this species in an area where we knew they were present, but bringing them kind of further along the creek into a patch that was lacking in natural hollows. So enabling them to hopefully breed up and keep dispersing throughout that area. And at another project site that we've got near Heathcote in a box ironbark forest, which pretty much was completely lacking natural hollows, we've installed a bunch of nest boxes, and they were taken up rapidly by sugar gliders, which number over 200 sugar gliders we've got now using those boxes. So we've really been able to boost population of a species that was present at the site in quite low numbers at the start of that project, and is now able to really flourish, and make use of the food sources that were already available, but it just wasn't able to capitalize because of lack of nesting. And I guess the last point I think we can all do in our works is to think long term. This project in Seymour, which was spearheaded by Seymour Urban Land Care and Hughes Creek Catchment Collaborative, particularly Vanessa Melandrin, who really led the charge on this project. Um, and it was done really strategically, trying to engage young people in land care, with a view that getting into younger demographics than a typical land care um, group will sort of help, I guess, the longevity of the work, and having students in particularly really invested in this work will boost its success in the long term. So they had year 11 and 12 woodwork students making nest boxes and learning all about the types of species that will use them. And then these boxes were installed along Whiteheads Creek, just in town in Seymour. And they also had a couple of really successful planting days, which were really strategic in picking gaps where there were patches of good vegetation along the creek, and then gaps in amongst that gliders and things like that wouldn't be able to move through. So planting a mix of eucalypts and wattles to build up to build that area up as a real corridor that the gliders can flourish and move along. Um, and that community is really embedded within that work now. And you can see from the photo from the newspaper clipping, again, a whole wide range of age groups and demographics there, which is a really key outcome of this work. So I guess I get put out there that any revegetation, almost any revegetation, is good, better than nothing. But with the limited resources we've all got, thinking strategically about revegetation and other restoration works is really critical to make sure that we're getting the best out of the resources that we have. So thinking about at a landscape scale and at a site scale, what type of habitat structural features and functions are missing at the site to best suit the species that could be there, that are there, and that should really be there. So what's next for us and for Glideways? We're going to keep doing more of this, sharing our learnings. We want to share our successes, and there's a couple of really exciting projects that are going on at the moment that hopefully over the next year or so we've got some really good things to share from that. I think it's also important to add to this that to share our failures as well as successes, even if that's just between groups and maybe not on a public stage, but we can learn so much from what didn't work and try and troubleshoot why. So I think it's really important that we don't get disheartened too much by the failures, but work out what went wrong and share them and sort of grow from those. I'm going to keep looking for gliders. We keep finding things in areas where we don't necessarily know whether they were there, and that just leads to more questions about where some of these species could turn up. And without knowing where they are and where they're not, it's very hard to come up with really thorough and strategic restoration plans. And sort of the next step from that is to identify some really key connectivity pathways throughout central Victoria. So at that really big landscape scale, as well as the project scale, as well as barriers, to try and work out which areas will be most efficient to target with future works. The real aim of all of this is to obviously scale up the restoration and recovery of habitat and species, but also the collaboration. We think this kind of framework for restoration work is really powerful. New collaborations and really strengthening old partnerships as well, and letting them grow is something that we've seen really powerful results from, and is going to continue to add to this landscape going forward as everyone brings sort of different strengths to the table. So new opportunities for collaborations, things like workshops and webinars, things like that, to keep spreading the good word. And we think we can really scale up our impact right across Central Victoria. That is all I want to talk to you about tonight, but hopefully we've got some questions and some time to answer them. Thanks.
Did we just get one question? Yes, we did. Good. Anyone else who'd like to ask a question to Chris, please feel free to drop it in the chat now. But Chrissy has asked Chris, what are some of the tree species favoured by gliders?
Good
And the great glider.
Yeah, good question. As you sort of, I guess, almost touched on there, that's going to be different for different species. So greater gliders we tend to get them in areas of sort of messmate, stringy bark, manna gums and peppermints, as well as blue gums. Yellow-bellied gliders, I can't say for certain. Not a real, not a species I've particularly worked on. I know in some areas of Queensland, they absolutely love spotted gums. But in the Victorian populations, I'm not too sure, I'm sorry. But beyond that, things like phascogales really like your tree species, like your stringy bark, and um, things with rough bark to be able to, easily climb up and down, as well as the stringy bark and your ribbon bark sort of species for nesting materials. And I've seen sugar gliders using ribbon bark and stringy bark for nests as well. So yeah, highly variable between species, but there's definitely some preferences.
Chrissy says, great, thanks, Chris. Great presentation. And one question from me. Of the species that you talked about, Chris, which of the gliders have the longest range in terms of their gliding distance?
Ooh, greater gliders, I believe. So I think it's just through pure size they can go the furthest. But yellow-bellied gliders are very similar, so they're both kind of quoted at potentially gliding up to 100 meters, particularly if they're on a slope and got a tall tree. So yeah, it's a pretty impressive effort for an animal that size to go 100 meters between trees, I think. Yeah, otherwise I think the squirrels and sugar gliders can go about 50. But
Yeah, very impressive. Sid has asked a question about funding, which I can also answer if you want, Chris. But yeah, he's basically asked what are the funding sources we currently have for our Glideways projects, and what are some of the challenges ahead in terms of funding?
yeah, lots of challenges. Glideways, I guess, as a program, there's no ongoing core funding. We're really running that on donations and philanthropy, really. And then at a project level, it's often operating on really small, not small, but grants and short term funding cycles, which makes this work hard as well. So yeah, I think that there's the biggest challenge is probably the lack of long term investment in this sort of work, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. It's yeah, we're not seeing that multi-year funding to get really big collaborative projects up. It's piecemeal at the moment. With that said, we're doing as much as we can with the funding that we have available to us, and yeah, we're getting a lot of really interesting and well-deserving projects up with the limited funds that we have. Like Chris mentioned as well, we've got the Beam Tallarook glider project at the moment, which will be running out of funding relatively soon, but we're hoping to get some more to keep that project going, because that's a really important one as well. Okay, and we've got a question from Ruth. Have any of these gliders been sighted in her area, I assume around Alexandra? Do you know if there are records in that area?
Alexandra. You're possibly not too far from some greater glider areas. I don't know for sure. I would imagine you'd have sugar gliders around and probably feathertail gliders as well, particularly in the taller. If I'm thinking correctly, that there's some sort of taller forest areas around Alexandra. But yeah, I don't know it intimately, unfortunately.
Could she jump onto iNaturalist or something and have a look?
Yeah, so iNaturalist or the Atlas of Living Australia would be your two best bets to jump on and have a quick look. And you can sort of zoom right into your area and see what other people have recorded.
And then Jerry has asked, what other fauna can benefit from habitat restoration for gliders?
Good question. And that is, yeah, one of the really key aspects, I guess, of glideways, why we've chosen them as our kind of umbrella species is there's a whole heap that can also benefit. So depending on areas we're working in areas that are, important for koalas, important for swift parrots, powerful owls. And powerful owls is kind of twofold. So we're protecting habitat as well as sort of the other side of it is we're providing a food source to powerful owls by benefiting gliders as well. Barking owls are in a similar boat. By looking after the wombat forest and the habitat around there, we're also protecting endangered population of mountain skink that was recently discovered there. But yeah, a whole suite. Even things like phascogales and squirrel gliders that are in more of the woodland sort of habitat. There's massive benefits for a lot of our threatened woodland birds in those areas by promoting connectivity and habitat restoration in those areas. So yeah, there's countless species I think that benefit from a lot of these works.
And they're a great indicator in terms of connectivity in the landscape as well, just more generally. Yeah. Chris has asked, how has the recent spotlighting been going in the Mount Disappointment area? Any yellow belly gliders or greater gliders been observed?
Yes, thanks, Chris. We found a few greater gliders in Mount Disappointment. We haven't heard or seen any yellow bellies in there yet, but I'm hopeful. But yes, that project is coming along really nicely, and we've found greater gliders in kind of new spots in Mount Disappointment, I suppose, where they hadn't been recorded before, and we're sort of heading north from there, if you know the area. So, which I know you do, Chris. So, yeah, hopefully we've got sort of something. We're sort of coming to the end of the current round of surveys and current round of funding for that project, so we'll have a bit of a report on that sort of later in the year, I think.
Um, and Jerry has asked, what's wrong with South Australia? The feather glider stops right at the Victorian border. Do you know the answer to that, Chris?
Uh, where do I start?
Be
No,
nice to
not
South
enough.
Australia.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to offend anyone. No, there's just the yeah, just a question of habitat. There's not enough of those tall forests, going along that across the border there, and it's there's a bit of a pattern there with a lot of these glider species where they don't tend to extend much into South Australia, other than phascogales will go in, and again they're more willing to kind of traverse open habitat. So it's certainly a pretty strong link with forest cover.
Yeah. And just so you know, Ruth, Chris has replied to your message about sightings of gliders in and around Alexandra, saying sugar gliders can be found along the rail trail and Mount Pleasant. There you go. All right, I think that's all the questions, so I'll pass it back to you, Chris, and maybe we'll wrap up and then we'll get Sophie on.
Yeah, cool. I just want to say a quick thank you for everyone who's tuned in. Thank you to all of our supporters and donors for Glideways to date. This work doesn't happen without you.